The other day, I was talking with a friend about raising children. We were reflecting on the challenges of instilling values in a world that often seems at odds with our deepest convictions. My friend, a devout Christian, sighed and said, "It's the original sin, you know? We're all born with this inherent flaw, this tendency towards selfishness and disobedience." His words struck a chord, not because I agreed, but because they echoed a belief system I had long abandoned. It made me wonder, how does this idea of original sin, a concept so central to Christianity, hold up to scrutiny? Is it a timeless truth or a relic of a bygone era? As a scholar of the Bible, I've spent years wrestling with these questions. The story of Adam and Eve, their disobedience in the Garden of Eden, and the subsequent fall from grace is a cornerstone of Christian theology. It's a narrative deeply ingrained in our collective consciousness, shaping our understanding of human nature and our place in the cosmos. But what if we were to approach this story not as an article of faith, but as a piece of literature, rich in symbolism and open to interpretation? What if we dared to question its validity, its relevance to our lives today? The doctrine of original sin asserts that Adam and Eve's transgression in the Garden of Eden resulted in a primordial stain, a kind of spiritual corruption inherited by all humanity. This inherited sinfulness, according to traditional Christian teaching, separates us from God, dooming us to an eternity of suffering unless we accept Christ's sacrifice as atonement for our inherited guilt. It's a powerful narrative, one that has resonated with billions for centuries. But is it true? The implications of accepting original sin as truth are profound. It shapes our understanding of human nature, painting us as inherently flawed, predisposed to sin. It impacts our relationships, casting a shadow of suspicion and judgment over even the most innocent interactions. And it influences our views on justice, punishment, and redemption. But what if this foundational belief, this cornerstone of faith, is based on shaky ground? What if the concept of original sin is more about control than truth, a tool used to instill fear and obedience rather than promote genuine spiritual growth? The traditional Christian understanding of original sin hinges on the biblical account of Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden. As the story goes, God created Adam and Eve and placed them in a paradise, the Garden of Eden. They were given one rule, not to eat from the tree of knowledge of good and evil. Tempted by the serpent, they disobeyed God, ate the forbidden fruit, and were subsequently banished from Eden. This act of disobedience, this primordial sin, had catastrophic consequences, not only for Adam and Eve, but for all their descendants. According to this interpretation, Adam and Eve's sin introduced sin and death into the world. Prior to their transgression, humanity lived in a state of innocence and harmony with God. However, their disobedience fractured this relationship, corrupting human nature and bringing sin, suffering, and death into existence. This stain of sin, this original sin, is believed to be passed down from generation to generation, tainting all of humanity. The concept of original sin is further reinforced through the writings of the Apostle Paul, particularly in his letter to the Romans. Paul argues that just as sin entered the world through one man, Adam, so too did salvation come through one man, Jesus Christ. He writes, "Therefore, just as sin entered the world through one man, and death through sin, and in this way death came to all people, because all sinned." Romans 5:12. Paul's interpretation cemented the idea of original sin as a core tenet of Christian doctrine. This traditional understanding of original sin has profound implications for how Christians view themselves and their relationship with God. If we are all born with this inherent flaw, this predisposition to sin, then we are inherently separated from a God who is holy and perfect. We are in need of redemption, of a Savior to atone for our inherited guilt. This belief underpins the Christian emphasis on salvation through Christ, as it is only through His sacrifice, according to this doctrine, that we can be cleansed of our original sin and reconciled with God. However, the traditional interpretation of original sin is not without its critics. Even within Christian circles, there are diverse perspectives on the nature and extent of original sin. Some theologians argue that original sin is not a literal inheritance of guilt, but rather a state of deprivation, a lack of the original holiness that Adam and Eve enjoyed before the fall. Others suggest that original sin is more about our inclination towards sin, a kind of spiritual weakness or susceptibility to temptation, rather than an actual imputation of guilt for Adam's sin. From a more secular perspective, the idea of inheriting guilt for the actions of a distant ancestor is often seen as illogical and unjust. How can we be held accountable for something we did not choose, for a sin committed long before we were born? This concept seems to contradict our modern understanding of personal responsibility, where individuals are generally held accountable only for their own actions. Moreover, the idea of a primordial fall from grace, a historical event that forever altered the course of human history, raises questions about the nature of good and evil, free will, and the very existence of a benevolent God. The story of Adam and Eve can be interpreted in various ways, not necessarily as a literal account of historical events. Some scholars view it as an allegory, a symbolic representation of the human condition, our capacity for both good and evil, and the consequences of our choices. Others see it as a myth, a story passed down through generations that reflects the cultural and religious beliefs of the time it was written. Regardless of one's interpretation, questioning the literal truth of the Adam and Eve story inevitably leads to a reassessment of the doctrine of original sin. Stepping outside the confines of traditional Christian thought, we encounter a wide range of perspectives on human nature and the origins of morality. Philosophers, psychologists, and anthropologists offer alternative explanations for human behavior, challenging the notion of an inherent flaw passed down through generations. These secular perspectives often emphasize the role of environment, upbringing, and social conditioning in shaping our moral compass. Evolutionary biology, for instance, offers a compelling explanation for our capacity for both selfishness and altruism without resorting to the concept of original sin. From an evolutionary standpoint, traits that promote survival and reproduction are more likely to be passed down through generations. In this context, cooperation, empathy, and a sense of fairness can be understood as advantageous traits that enhance social cohesion and, ultimately, survival. Psychology provides insights into the development of our moral reasoning, highlighting the role of childhood experiences, cultural norms, and cognitive development in shaping our understanding of right and wrong. The work of renowned psychologists such as Jean Piaget and Lawrence Kohlberg suggests that our moral compass is not fixed at birth, but rather evolves over time through a complex interplay of nature and nurture. Anthropological studies of diverse cultures reveal a wide range of moral codes and belief systems. While there are some common threads, such as prohibitions against murder and theft, there is also significant variation in what is considered morally acceptable or taboo, depending on cultural context. This diversity of moral expressions across cultures challenges the notion of a universal, inherent human nature tainted by original sin. The ramifications of adhering to the doctrine of original sin extend far beyond theological debates. The belief that we are inherently flawed, born with a stain on our souls, can have profound psychological and social implications. It can foster a sense of shame, inadequacy, and guilt, even for actions we did not commit. This internalized sense of unworthiness can manifest in various ways, from low self-esteem and self-sabotaging behaviors to a constant need for external validation and approval. Moreover, the doctrine of original sin can be used to justify social hierarchies and systems of oppression. If some groups of people are considered inherently more sinful or closer to their animalistic nature due to their race, ethnicity, gender, or sexual orientation, then it becomes easier to rationalize their subjugation and mistreatment. Throughout history, the concept of original sin has been used to legitimize slavery, colonialism, and discrimination against marginalized communities. The idea of inherited guilt can also create a culture of fear and judgment, where individuals are constantly scrutinized for signs of their inherent sinfulness. This can lead to an environment of suspicion and mistrust, hindering genuine connection and compassion. When we view ourselves and others through the lens of original sin, it's challenging to extend grace, forgiveness, and understanding. It can foster a punitive rather than restorative approach to justice, emphasizing punishment over rehabilitation. However, if we reject the notion of original sin and embrace the idea that we are born with a clean slate, responsible for our own choices and actions, it does not necessarily lead to moral chaos or a decline in ethical behavior. On the contrary, it can be incredibly empowering. When we acknowledge our agency, our capacity to choose between right and wrong, we step into our full potential as moral beings. Embracing personal responsibility means acknowledging the consequences of our actions, both positive and negative. It means holding ourselves accountable for the choices we make and striving to live in alignment with our values. This can be a daunting task, but it is also incredibly liberating. It frees us from the shackles of inherited guilt and empowers us to create a more just and compassionate world. Moreover, recognizing that we are not inherently flawed, but rather products of our environment, upbringing, and choices, allows for greater empathy and understanding. It encourages us to approach others, not with judgment and condemnation, but with compassion and a willingness to understand the factors that have shaped their lives. This shift in perspective can pave the way for more meaningful connections, stronger communities, and a more just and equitable society. If we release ourselves from the constraints of original sin, how do we then define morality? If our moral compass is not pre-programmed by a divine decree, then where does it originate? These are complex questions with no easy answers. However, exploring these questions can lead to a deeper understanding of ourselves and the ethical frameworks that guide our lives. One approach is to view morality as a social construct, a set of rules and principles developed over time to promote social cohesion and well-being. From this perspective, morality is not about adhering to a fixed set of divine commandments, but rather about navigating the complexities of human relationships and striving to create a society that values fairness, justice, and compassion. Another perspective is to ground morality in our shared humanity, recognizing that despite our differences, we all share certain fundamental needs and desires. We all crave connection, belonging, and a sense of purpose. We all experience joy, sorrow, love, and loss. It is in these shared experiences, in our common humanity, that we can find a basis for ethical behavior, a call to treat others with the same dignity and respect that we ourselves desire. The concept of sin itself, when stripped of its theological baggage, can be understood as a natural consequence of our capacity for both good and evil, our ability to make choices that either harm or benefit ourselves and others. From this perspective, sin is not a stain on our souls, but rather a reflection of our ongoing struggle to live in alignment with our values, to bridge the gap between our ideals and our actions. The story of Adam and Eve, then, can be seen as a timeless allegory for the human condition, our constant grappling with temptation, our susceptibility to selfishness and greed, and the consequences of our choices. It reminds us that even in the midst of paradise, even with the best of intentions, we are capable of making choices that lead to suffering and separation. However, it also reminds us that we have the power to choose differently. We can choose compassion over indifference, forgiveness over resentment, and love over fear. We can learn from our mistakes, strive to make amends for the harm we have caused, and dedicate ourselves to creating a world where love, justice, and compassion prevail. Ultimately, the question of original sin is not about finding the right answer. It's about engaging in a process of critical thinking, questioning assumptions, and exploring alternative perspectives. It's about wrestling with complex theological and philosophical concepts and arriving at our own understanding of human nature, morality, and the meaning of life. So I leave you with these questions. Is the concept of original sin a helpful or harmful one? Does it promote spiritual growth or hinder our ability to embrace our full humanity? How does our understanding of sin shape our relationships with ourselves, others, and the world around us? These are questions worth pondering. Questions that challenge us to move beyond dogma and embrace the complexities of faith, reason, and the human experience.